Hello, everyone. This is Matthew Blaine. Welcome to the Matthew Blaine podcast. This is episode number one. The intention of the podcast, I would say, is threefold. First intention is to focus on the theme of learning and development. So anything that's teaching or mentoring, training, betterment, coaching, anything in that world would be, let's say, intention number one. Also would love to learn about different professions, different businesses, and have guests that can tell us about what they do and what their career is all about. And then thirdly and finally, we'll just kind of keep it open, see where it goes, see what unfolds, see what we can explore that is unplanned. So those are kind of the big three in terms of a plan here. And I'll launch right into it for today. Our first guest of the podcast is Douglas Blaine. He is my father. So, Douglas, welcome to the first episode of the Matthew Blaine podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you for being here. So, we're going to jump into it, but I do want to ask you for any contact information you'd like to share in case any of our listeners or our followers would like to contact you after the episode or at some point in the future. So, what contact information will you provide?
Well, you could email me. I have an email account at St. John's University where I'm an adjunct instructor. Blaine D at stjohns.edu, stjohns.edu.
Okay. So one more time, that's going to be Blaine and the letter D as in Douglas at
stjohns.edu.
stjohns.edu. Okay.
Right.
Thank you for sharing that. And as mentioned in the intro there, one of the top three things I'd like to do during this podcast going forward is learning and development. That's going to be a key theme. So when I hear L&D, I think teaching, training, coaching, facilitating, mentoring, improving, betterment, and so on. So I figured you'd be a great first guest to have because I think of education, right? I think of teaching. That's something that's been important to you. It's a passion of yours. It's been a big part of your life's work. So I'm thinking today we'll probably talk a bit about teaching and education. But again, that third kind of intention of the podcast, we'll just see where this goes. So it's kind of unscripted and we'll have some fun with it. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay. So why don't you tell everybody just a little bit about yourself, just about who you are, a little bit about your life and your career and so on.
Mhm. Well, the last paying job that I have is as an adjunct instructor in theology at St. John's University in Queens. Um, I've done that for 12 years. Prior to that, I worked as a director of faith formation for a parish in South Queens, which involved what's traditionally been called religious education. Uh, Currently, we wouldn't call it religious education; we'd call it faith formation. But it involved, hiring and training catechists who would be teaching young children to prepare for receiving First Communion and confirmation, also working with adults, preparing them for baptism. So a lot of experience doing that. I also did that for about 12 years. Prior to that, I had a career in construction management with the New York City Housing Authority, um, and basically a family business prior to that in plumbing construction. So I have quite a diverse amount of experience. I did serve for quite a few years on the Diocese of Brooklyn Advisory Committee for Schools. So I have some experience doing, examining the administrative issues in education and also working with certain local schools on intervention teams when the schools were having trouble recruiting and keeping open. So I have quite a diverse number of experiences.
Okay. Great. And where are you coming to us from today? I see that's your home office, and where are you located today?
I'm located in South Ozone Park in Queens. New York, a walking distance to Kennedy Airport. My wife and I have walked to the airport to fly out, and we've walked back from the airport, so we're that close. Um, it's a lot of people confuse it with Ozone Park, but this is South Ozone Park.
Okay. Okay. How long have you been there in South Ozone Park?
I've been here 46 years. Uh, my wife and I, we were married in 1976, and then we spent 2 years in an apartment in Brooklyn, and then we moved into this house, and we've been here ever since.
Okay. And prior to Brooklyn, where were your roots prior?
I'm from Staten Island originally, so I'm still living on an island. A lot of people don't realize that Brooklyn and Queens are on Long Island, along with Nassau and Suffolk.
Mhm.
So I grew up in Staten Island. Uh, all of my elementary school time was before the Verrazano Bridge. Then I went to college in the District of Columbia. I graduated from Catholic University. So I spent some time down in Washington, D.C., and then moved back to the city.
How is it like living on an island?
Well, if it was a very small island, it would be insular, but Staten Island and Long Island are pretty large. So, you don't, except for the experience of taking the ferry before the Verrazano Bridge, you wanted to leave Staten Island, coming to any other part of New York City, it involved a ferry. So I remember taking the ferry to Brooklyn to watch basketball games when I was in high school, and of course, many times taking the ferry to Manhattan for anything going on, going to see the Yankees. We would take the ferry and then the subway up to the Bronx and so forth. Brooklyn, rather, New Jersey, we always had bridges. So you could take the Bayonne Bridge or the Goethals Bridge or the Outer Bridge to get to New Jersey. But to get to any place in New York City, it involved a ferry in the beginning.
Okay. And I feel like we thank you for sharing that. I feel like we have a lot to sink our teeth in today with this podcast, especially with your
Okay.
extensive background in education and teaching and your diverse background. Do want to cover the duration of the podcast. So I per AI and per Google, there's no limit to a Zoom call in terms of duration. So we're recording this on Zoom. We're going to upload to YouTube for the podcast. And so there's no, we can talk for quite some time, basically in perpetuity, according to AI. So Zoom doesn't have a limit. And
I think
my,
the
my
people
mom,
who
go ahead. Mom said you've been kind of, this is a moment where you kind of been training for you don't mind talking, right? So
I don't mind talking, but your audience might have a problem listening.
but they could
There's
always
going to
turn it
be
off. They could always
you have
turn
to
it
have
off.
mercy on the audience, right?
This is true, but they could turn it off at any time. They could mute or turn it off anytime they want, or pause it and come back later and listen to you some more. So we could go. I mean, this could go on for quite some time. It could be like either a Rand Paul or a Cory Booker like filibuster type thing where you can talk for 24 hours if you want. So that's we can there's no limit. So let's have well, but just to give you that don't feel any time pressure. We could go on for as long as we want.
Okay,
Okay.
no
So
pressure.
what's a topic that's been on your mind recently when it comes to, we'll say, education slash teaching? What's been on your mind?
I would say most recently, the pervasive ignorance of so many people. Um, Things that you would assume people know something about, at least they have heard. For instance, the war in Gaza or the Holocaust. You would think most people have heard these, but surprisingly, many people haven't heard them. I don't know why. It's just now there is also a problem in American education. We've dropped certain things that were standard in a liberal education, like civics, history, government, um, they're just not part of the curriculum anymore. So unfortunately, young people, and I see them in college. They come into my classroom, and when I'm teaching, I'm assuming a certain knowledge base, and much to my surprise, they don't have this knowledge base. Um, it's the simple things like in which direction is the Atlantic Ocean? Or if I say let's go to the end of Long Island, and what ocean will we come to? They don't know a lot of them. I had a case a couple of years ago, um, asking for the capital of Italy. Now, you would think almost everybody would know Rome, and even if they were a little unsure, they would come up with Naples or Milan. They don't know anything. So it's been a subject of conversation in my life with my wife about how little people know, and that's I'm not pinning blame on any particular group or people, but to be an adult, you need to know a lot of things in order to be successful. So,
Okay. So it sounds like there's been some type of change where there's a pervasive, you feel there's a pervasive ignorance now, but is this in contrast to 10, 20, 30 years ago? Do you feel a real a change, a tangible change?
well, I couldn't say, with certainty, but I do know that my education, and I think people of my age, for the most part, got similar educations. Um, they were very, very strong in liberal arts issues like history, language, literature. Uh, I mean, uh, uh, I just remember learning a lot of things, even in elementary school. Started, of course, at home, right? You know, and it's probably a stereotype, but I think when I was growing up as elementary school age, uh, most children had at least one parent at home with them for most of the day. There were women who worked, but they worked part-time, doctors, officers, phone company operators. So they were around more. And I can remember many times sitting down on the couch with my mother, reading to her. She would read to me. So we began learning. It's important to begin learning at the very earliest age. And when people are required to work outside the home in order to have some kind of a comfortable living, they come home, they're too tired, and they don't spend that kind of time with their children. And as a result, children don't start learning as early as they could. And then it's compounded by their educational experiences in kindergarten, first, second grade, primary grades. Um, you know, and education is critical to having a successful, happy life. It's liberal arts education is to liberate you from ignorance. So I'm concerned about the quality of American education, not just in the school, but in the homes too.
Okay. And you talk about your childhood a bit there, and I'm not the biggest fan of kind of dividing things into different generations because I don't think it's always that neat and tidy when there's this generation and called the baby boomers or this generation called the millennials. But this exists. There are these generations out there and they're labeled for a reason. It's not always black and white, but you are technically a baby boomer. Is that your generation? Because you were born in
Yeah,
1947, so
right.
post World War II.
Too.
So a
Right.
lot of baby, a
Which
lot of
is another thing that a lot of people don't know anything about.
okay, okay. So that generation, that was a lot of celebration going on and a lot of procreation going on. So there was this boom of babies in the late 40s, early 50s. And when did the baby boomer generation, when does that, if we're getting kind of pseudo
Any
technical, when does that
anytime
go until?
anytime after World War II, when the troops came home. See, uh, wars today are not fought the way they were in those days. There was a general mobilization, a draft, and almost every able-bodied American male was in the service, and many of them were overseas, and many of them were in combat. Large numbers, large numbers of casualties. Well, when the war, and also keep in mind that that generation, before they went into war, were living through the Great Depression, and um, it was we don't realize how bad it was. I mean, Central Park was a big homeless encampment. Uh, whole communities of people living who were evicted, had no job, couldn't get a job, and so forth. So when veterans came home from World War II, uh, they had it was a shock to the system. They had grown up from childhood in adverse conditions, and now they came back. The war was over, and the economy was booming. Don't forget, unfortunately, war economies, everybody's working. So, so they came back, and what a lot of people had to defer marriage until they could get an apartment because apartments were in short supply. Um, so, you know, the generation, that generation, men and women, found themselves in a position where they had opportunities that they hadn't dreamed of. Um, and you know, it led to a strong rise in the middle class. The so-called 50s, right? Now the baby boomers like myself, we were born from that generation. We were born, and our experience took place in the 50s. A lot of ignorance also because we were, products of our environment. There were certain things that were not talked about. Like I just recently read a few novelettes by Louis L'Amour. And Louis L'Amour, he wrote a lot of Western stories, and a lot of them were made into movies in the 50s. And, it was the good guys and the bad guys. The good guys rode white horses, the bad guys rode black horses. The Indians were bad. They were always, scalping people. Um, complete ignorance of the actual history of America. So, but there was prosperity. Anyway, that's the baby boomer generation. A very disciplined, kind of homogenous. But of course, I'm speaking from my own background, which was white. Uh, if I was African American living in the South at that time, I wouldn't have had the same experience. But within the household, within the family, I think a lot of the influences were similar. People working, coming home, trying to raise their children in the right way. Um, but the world itself was quite different depending on where you were uh, in that social scene.
Okay. And what generation followed the baby boomer generation?
Uh, I don't know. Uh, we came of age, so to speak, in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, where we began having families of our own. And the next we talk in terms of generations, right? So the next generation would have been people like you, right? And of course, um, I'm sure you and your friends were insulated from it, but there was a lot of stress. We had the Vietnam War, we had the Civil Rights Movement. There was a lot of um, turmoil and troubles uh, that we experienced, the baby boomers experienced, as they, emerged into adulthood and began raising their own families. Um, and I think that's another thing a lot of contemporary people are ignorant about is just how much struggle there was. Um, People going to jail for refusing the draft, people escaping to Canada, all the different struggles of the civil rights movement, Kent State. I mean, burning draft cards, burning down campus buildings, ROTC buildings being burned. A lot of violence. But your generation uh, didn't experience that, but your parents' generation obviously did. But I don't know what your generation would be called. There's Z, A, millennial. There's two. I don't have I don't know all the terms, and I don't have the chart. You need a chart to figure out who's who.
Yeah,
You know?
I don't buy too much into those kind of neat and tidy. I think I'm technically a millennial, so I'm 46 now, born in
Uh,
1979. So I think I'm right on the precipice of millennial, but I don't know what's between baby boomers and millennials. Maybe there's something between, but and then now there's generation X and Alpha and so on. But I also want to add that in the 1960s with the Vietnam War, with all the trouble and the strife and the stress, let's also not forget all the troops that went over there were killed. So there was a lot of it wasn't
oh,
just it
absolutely.
wasn't just the people going to jail protesting or the people
Uh, uh,
getting they were teenagers getting drafted, going off to war and dying. Many teenagers, if I'm not mistaken,
well,
in
if you
early
can
20s and
find
so on.
if you can find the time period where that is not true,
Mhm.
please let me know, because there's always war going on someplace, and that's, you've heard me say this. Uh, you take a tour of Europe, and one of the high points is visiting all these castles, and we have this romantic view of these castles and knights in shining armor and so forth, touristy places. But meanwhile, they were built because if you didn't have a castle to get behind the walls, you'd get killed,
Mhm.
because people, one tribe, one city to another, war, constant war. So there's really nothing new at that. There's been lulls, though. There have been lulls, and you get a false sense of security. But then that ugly head of war, resurfaces.
Just wanted to add that in there and talking about the 1960s and the Vietnam War is because that is, in my generation, there hasn't been a draft, right? There haven't been teenagers going off and dying at war, whereas the World War II generation, which are they nicknamed the greatest generation, the ones who went off to war in the World War II?
Second World War.
Is that
Yeah,
their nickname, the greatest generation?
maybe. Yeah,
And
yeah.
then so anyway, there are differences. There are differences in that way in terms of how we've our experiences and what we've lived through. So going back to the education, talking about the boomers
Uh,
of the 1950s and education beginning in the home, there were a lot of times intact families, mother, father, and one of them, oftentimes the mother, was at home. And education started there. But also in the schools, there was a concentration on liberal arts, meaning there was history, civics, language was important. Um,
right.
what else do you remember about your grammar school and those years in terms of what you were learning and what you were being taught?
Yeah. Well, they were hard. I mean, we had a lot of homework, you know, and a lot of pressure put on students to do well. I mean, not in all cases, not in all cases. Um, um, and a lot of social stresses, uh, bullies, uh, cliques. There was all of that. Um, you know, the general pressures of living any time in any place. But you know, we learned. Next chapter, do the work at the end of the chapter. Do your homework. Your homework graded. You get your report cards. Parent teacher nights. I mean, um, we just learned a lot. Let's put it that way, and we were expected to learn a lot. Um, Now, I always say a division occurred in the fourth grade because I think it was the fourth grade is when you started to do your times tables. Well, the division actually occurred earlier because you had non-readers. Uh, in those days, it was customary, the teacher would call on a student and you'd have to read out loud and you'd read for a little while and then the student behind you would pick up where you left off and then the student behind that person. So, and you always had these kids who had difficulty reading, and you get to that student, and then you'd have to cringe because you say, "Oh," because they would agonize over simple words and so forth. So there was a differentiation that occurred uh, before the fourth grade, but in the fourth grade it became very heightened because the times tables is strictly a memory thing. And you had students that couldn't do it, so that's where you started to see a differentiation where you had your advanced students and you had your students that were less advanced, and of course that stayed with them through elementary school. There was A students and there were D students, and but I mean, I, I I don't have any answer to that dilemma. If it's even a dilemma, you know what I mean. Different people learn in different ways. I've had this discussion with mommy a lot. We put a high priority on reading and math, science. But what about art? What about music? What about softer skills like interpersonal skills? They don't show up on a report card, and they're very important in and of themselves. But in any case, but I remember elementary school uh, being rigorous. Let's put it that way, rigorous.
Okay. And it sounded earlier too, there was this element of discipline and this element of rigor that was more prevalent, at least in this country and education back then than it is maybe today. Also wanted to comment as we talked about the different generations and different wars. Yeah, for my generation, there hasn't been a draft. But I do want to thank everybody for their service, not just the Vietnam War and World War II, but also my generation. There were a lot of volunteers after 9/11. So, and
Right.
there was death and destruction and turmoil. Now, a lot of that occurred overseas and wasn't covered maybe as much as the Vietnam War, but a lot of people came back from that and were also troubled with
Oh yeah. Yeah. No
disabilities
question.
and mental problems and lost limbs and so on. So and it affected them and their family. So it has affected my. I just wanted to add that in there because I was thinking about Vietnam and that, but my generation but it hasn't been a draft, right? It's been
Right.
volunteer, but that's kind of, I guess that's our version of that. So I don't want to leave that out because I do want to thank
Right.
everybody for their
And, uh,
service that's
and,
coming
and
up
of course,
during this
of
podcast.
course, the all volunteer service meant that only a certain element of society bore those burdens. Uh, the Vietnam War, not everybody was drafted, not everybody went to war, but it represented all different levels of society. Especially when they went to the lottery, and everybody was included. You didn't have the exemptions that you had before that. But today, it's a volunteer army, and there's certain sections of society they don't participate. Um, and yeah, I mean the horrors of war are always the same. Death, maiming, destruction, mental problems, PTSD, and so forth. And those problems are exhibited in a smaller segment of society, but they're very real, and
I also wanted
those
to
people should not be forgotten. That's for sure.
That's for sure. And wanted to also maybe add some perspective that we're talking about the United States during this podcast today, right? But we're talking about education in the United States, history, and um, and education. But we're one of um, 180 countries or so, 200 countries.
Mm.
So we start to look at, okay, ignorance, right, and or other countries, what are things like there? So I just wanted to give that perspective that we're talking about the US today
Right.
the
Mm,
state of affairs, but other countries might have different stories to tell about themselves and their discipline and their rigor and their
right.
advancement and their progress and how they look at us, how we look at them. So no, just a perspective there that maybe things aren't necessarily
That's right.
trending the right way other places as you feel like
You
they're
know,
trending here when it comes to
text,
ignorance, so to speak.
there's text, and then there's context, and context is critical. And I'm speaking about my context. It wouldn't apply to other contexts, even within the United States. Like I said, uh, different areas of the country, different racial groups had different contexts that they negotiated.
Mm.
Uh, I want to say a word about discipline. Uh, Discipline and the word disciple are from the same root. And a disciple is somebody who sits at the foot of a master. A common analogy would be the martial arts, where you come in as a neophyte and you sit um, at the foot of the Gen Z or Jitsu, whatever they call them, and then you are expected to model yourself after the master, and you become the disciple of the master, and you learn from the master, and the goal is to become like the master, equal to the master, in some cases to surpass the master. Um, we post the liberal agenda, and I'm talking about the modern liberal agenda from the starting from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. You know, people could they kind of many people would rankle at the idea of being at the foot of a master, because why shouldn't I be able to forge my own agenda? Why shouldn't I be able to go in my own direction? Well, maybe you should be able to do that, but the results are usually not that good. Uh, uh, but the discipline part is the ability to follow somebody who knows more than you. The liberal agenda, nobody knows more than me. I mean, if somebody wants to know more than me, that's somehow that's tyranny. They have tyranny over me, because what makes them so smart? But yet expertise, we should value expertise. The time for novelty and experimentation is after you have mastered those skills. And then if you have a liberal education and you're free, then you can go off in a different direction, but at least you have a platform to stand on. Um, Now that I don't know, maybe what I'm saying sounds a little controversial. I don't know, but the, this idea of truth. Well, everyone's got their own truth, and I don't really think that's true. um, but the whole purpose of a liberal arts education is to free you so that you are not a slave. A disciple is not a slave. You will have the opportunity to um, use your liberation to go off into new directions, and to have your own disciples at a future date. But you got to start with the basics. You can't start with nothing. You know. So I think that's part of it. I think somehow or other that's factored into the problem of modern education, because even the idea of memorization. Oh, it's bad, memorization, right? People should be able to, they don't have to memorize these things. You should be able to think about them, or read and think about them. Well, yes, that's true too, but you need to have memory. And so I think there are certain false narratives that have sprung up about education in the contemporary American situation.
Okay. So on the topic of discipline, so what I heard there is like there was the root of the word and talking about disciples and masters. Fair enough. If we go literal and we look at the root of the word and the derivation and the history of the word, but I also the way discipline now is used, like I feel like there could be discipline to a principle. It doesn't necessarily have to be to a person. So, for instance, if somebody has a 5 a.m. wake up time and they're very disciplined to that, they're disciplined to timeliness or disciplined to timing or whatever, or being prompt or whatever. There's a discipline to a principle. So how do you feel about that? Even though the root of the word, right, and the history of the word and other people being involved, but maybe we'll kick around discipline a little bit because I think you could be disciplined, self-disciplined to principles. It doesn't have to be to people. What do you think about that?
Well, it's denotation and connotation, right? Um, I spoke about a disciple in its denotation historically, but the connotation is, um, you know, if you set your alarm for 5:30 in the morning, you force yourself out of bed at 5:30 in the morning, and it's McChrystal, General McChrystal, right? Make your bed. You know, you could be a general, but you're supposed to make your bed. Yeah, so yeah, discipline. You could probably use other words if you wanted to, but discipline. That's discipline, right? Because ultimately, by the way, you are your own master. You know, the purpose of a liberal education is to enable you to be your own master. But putting yourself at the feet of a master and learning from the master is not a surrender of your freedom. It's actually how you become free. Because when you learn from the master, it puts you in a place where then you can exercise your freedom. You understand exactly what it is you're dealing with, and then you can modify it accordingly. So, but without, listen, if you don't put yourself at the foot of the master, if you say there's no such thing as a master, I'm my own master, you know what you are? You're a dog chasing your tail. That's the way I look at it.
Okay, if I was to challenge you in that, I would say there might be some people who declare themselves as masters, um, but they're not necessarily masters. They've mastered declaring themselves as masters, and it becomes more of a power or a control element to that than an expertise or
Right.
knowledge, and wanting to teach the neophytes, so to speak. So I guess that's where people have some trouble with is this perceived subservient relationship between them and these masters, these kind of masters of the universe, so or people, the know-it-alls, right? Some people call them the ivory tower elitists who know everything, and everybody else is more subservient as the dogs, right? The dogs. So you have the dogs and then the master or the elite. So I guess I'll challenge you and then we'll love your take on that when it comes to people who are really good at marketing themselves as masters, as experts, and are really great at doing that, but maybe they necessarily are not masters, which then causes, like you said, some folks to be like, hold on a sec, maybe I'll chart my own course. Maybe I'm getting misinformation or disinformation or propaganda, whatever you want to call it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd say two things. I'm going to come back to the ivory tower,
Mhm.
uh, but you're right. Um, if you want to be a disciple of a master, you want it to be a true master. Yeah, and we're talking about specific areas. I mean, if you want to become a medical doctor, your master is going to be somebody who's a medical doctor, right? So there's all kinds of masters, but you can attach yourself to a fraud, somebody who you think is a master at something, and they're not. And if you don't find that out soon enough, you could wind up wasting a whole lot of time. So there is, when I'm talking in ideal terms, right? A disciple learns from a master who's a true master at a certain thing. And the other business, I consider myself to be in the ivory tower school of education. I believe in the ivory tower, but not every tower is an ivory tower. There are fake values and there are fake um, um, schools of thought or trains of thought, fake narratives. that are out there that want to be an ivory tower, but they're a tower of brick and mud. Uh, and how do you tell the difference? Well, that's the goal of education. The goal of education, starting on your mother's knee, is so that you can tell that this is a false narrative, that you can make intelligent choices about who you're going to become a disciple to. And of course, mistakes do get made. There are frauds that are very professional and can trick a lot of people. They like the Pied Pipers of a false narrative. So, even the most well-educated, liberated person can be deceived, but there's less chance that you can be deceived when you have a strong liberal education behind you, and you can hear and you can think and smell, and after a while you can hopefully you can determine, well, this is a fraud, so I'm not going to be this disciple, right? But that's not to say that there's no such thing as a master. Obviously, there are masters, people who have spent their life on certain directions and have achieved a lot and have accomplished a lot, and those are the people you want to attach yourself to. You don't give up your freedom. I'm not suggesting that people become automatons, but you want to learn from somebody who's done it before, who's thought about these things, who's read what a lot of people. There's such a thing as people who have knowledge.
I guess I'll revisit this idea of the people versus principles, right? So to be disciplined when it comes to maybe the scientific method or critical thinking or being disciplined to principles or values, rather than necessarily people and following somebody, following that master or following that person in the ivory tower. I feel like a lot of problems develop when there's this cult of personality, when this oh, this person is charismatic and this person definitely seems knowledgeable and has some knowledge, but they have these leadership qualities. I'm going to follow them and maybe lose track of, focus on the people element, not so much the principle. So I think there could be an end statement there, obviously, but I do get a little bit, my antennas go up when I talk about following people and that they're their masters. Versus the principles, right? Like what principle is at play here? And that's a value that I hold dear. Let me stay true to that and to be disciplined to that rather than to a person. So I want to kick that around a little bit more because the people element can lead to, like you said, frauds, right? There's frauds, right? And maybe there's some people who have expertise, but then it levels out and you still admire them, but you realize that you can actually become the master, and
Yeah,
whether
well,
martial
that's
arts or liberal arts.
but that's the goal of discipleship, is to become the master. You don't stay a disciple your whole life. What you do is you 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 reach the point where you yourself become the master, and you go from there, and then you take what you have achieved, and then you develop it further. But you don't. It's not. I know it could sound like slave, right? A slave and the master and the slave. Disciples are not slaves, and the master does not intend to enslave his disciples. He intends to form them so that they can in turn be masters. It has to be done in a liberal or liberating way, but without having, first of all, for instance, just a simple thing. When you send your first grade child into a school, you expect the teacher to know something, not just content, but also to know how to teach. The teacher is expected to be an expert at teaching and to know more than the first grader knows. but the teacher is not intended to keep everybody at the first grade level. The teacher is supposed to, the student is a disciple of the teacher for a period of time and then goes on to the next teacher and goes on to the next. That student, if there wasn't somebody who knew how to teach, if there wasn't somebody who knew things that the first grader doesn't know, then why would you send them to school, right? So that's there's a fine line and there's a danger, right? How many people we read about that become disciples of frauds, and they wound up being taken advantage of, and they're never liberated, and they're like cultish. You know what I mean? They've surrendered their liberty. The master has taken their liberty away from them. The master is not supposed to do that. The master is supposed to be liberating. And eventually, goodbye. I've done everything I can for you, and now you're on your own, and you have something to work with, you know. But there's a lot of charlatans out there that they pretend. Well, listen, I have to say this, right? The internet makes this easy, right? Because anybody can put a YouTube together and spout out like you and I we're spouting out our ideas, right? We're trying to talk like we know what we're talking about. So anybody can do this on the internet, and people say, "Oh, well, look, this person knows what they're talking about." You have to, you have to, you have to be able to listen. Your ears have to be like a screen, filtering out certain things. I tell my students, and these are university students, people are lying to you every single minute of every single day, and you have to get a liberal arts education so that you can filter out these lies, at least most of them. Anyway, but I come from the ivory tower, so I'm sure a lot of people will say that guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right. Well, it's funny because that was going to be the very next thing I brought up, which is this idea of, so we talk about mastery, right? And I
Mhm.
feel like to be a real master is to really know, to kind of know that you're not a master, right? That it's a constant learning process. There's always more to learn in whatever discipline it is. And I think that you probably know better than me, but the Greek philosopher who said, the only thing I really know is that I know nothing, right? Is that Socrates maybe or Plato? But I feel like there's always starting each day and being willing to challenge your own premises that you've worked on before and understanding that learning is lifelong. And hey, I might have been wrong about something, or I might have been half wrong about it, or 75% wrong, and here's a better way. So this idea of like mastery almost can be sometimes thought of like as a stopping point or a destination. I feel like a real master is willing to be humble and
Right,
know that there
that's
might
right.
be a better way in order to even learn from
That's right.
their
Right.
students.
Well, you can become a tyrant to yourself.
Mhm.
You can be enslaved to your own biases and not be willing to reconsider, not be willing to move on.
Mhm.
Uh, so being a liberated person means you have to have this humility that you're talking about and realize that. And I've had this experience, by the way, where I've been so convinced of something, and I've been confronted by people and conversations, and then I sit back and I think, and then I realize, you know what? I was wrong, and they were right.
Mhm.
Um, so that doesn't mean you're not a master. A master has to be humble and learn and be willing to learn.
Mhm.
That's part of being liberated is the willingness to learn and to know you don't know everything. Um, you have to know that there are certain things you don't know, or let's put it this way, things that you know a lot about, but you don't know everything. And sometimes, in history, my first field was history, revisionism, right? Revisionist history. Sometimes people say, oh, that's revisionist history. History is always being revised, right? Let's take another look at this group of data. Let's see, maybe the conclusions now have to be a little different. Maybe we know a little bit more. Uh, you know, and every generation is going to revisit the fundamentals and take another look. So that's, being a disciple to a master is not intended to lock you in. It's supposed to unlock you. Uh, anyway,
Okay. So what's an example of, we'll say a bias that maybe you had where you were a tyrant to yourself and you had convinced or you convinced yourself or you were convinced for maybe quite some time of this bias or you believed was the truth. And then you had this, we'll say epiphany and oh my gosh, like shoot, I was wrong. What's an example of that?
I probably have some trouble thinking of particular examples. I guess I grew up thinking I knew the history of the world,
Mhm.
right? Because I took world history. I took it in elementary school, I took it in high school. Uh, but I realized the world's a big place, and there are lots of parts of the world that we didn't learn anything about. You know, um, uh, when I grew up in Staten Island, up until the time I went to college, as far as I knew, there was nobody, no Islamic person living on Staten Island. Uh, I didn't have the experience of intermingling with Islamic people. And I had limited experience mingling with Jewish people, but I did know Jewish people. There were Jewish people lived on my block. I hung out with a Jewish kid for a while. So I knew that, but in Islam, Hindu, that was the storybooks, the movies of Omar Khayyam and all of that stuff. So I've come to learn a lot because I've had the opportunity to work and live among people. A turban. You see a person with a turban. If that's the first person you've ever seen with a turban, you're going to say, "Huh, what's that all about?" But when you've lived with a lot of Sikh people and you've talked to them and you've seen them raising their children and going to work and so forth, you know, um, it's not such a big deal. Well, that's something I learned, and the initial shock of seeing something strange wears off, and after a while, any bias you had is more or less dissipated because of your life experience.
Mhm.
So that might be one example. You know,
Okay. Going back a little bit to this kind of where we started with this ignorance, right? And we started talking about generations. Like you're
uh,
70, what, eight? You 78 now? I'm 46. So you're 78, yes? Years old?
yes,
I'm 46. So we'll say
you're trying to catch up, but you're not going to catch up.
loosely speaking, baby boomer, we'll say millennial, even though maybe a little bit older than most millennials. But then we have this next, let's say uh, the 20s, the 20-year-olds, right? The 20, whatever generation that is, X, Alpha, whatever it's called. So we're looking at them. I'm kind of sensing that that is where you're seeing some of the ignorance in this next generation that's coming up in the school system or in the university system and in your context, right? Your day to day or the exposure you've had. So tell me
Well,
more about this ignorant, like where this ignorance, do you feel like it's tell me more about the ignorance that you see in
some of it,
your context.
some of it is vicarious. In other words, it's not something that I've observed, but people have told me about.
Mhm.
Uh, I've seen it in an academic environment. I'm pretty much talking about. Uh, and I'll say this is a bias, by the way. Getting back to the question first, I used to assume that that the people I was talking to had a certain shared knowledge base. So, for instance, like Bruce Springsteen. Right? I've never listened really to Bruce Springsteen, but I certainly know who Bruce Springsteen is. College age students, I would mention Bruce Springsteen, and they would have this. I say, how many of you have heard of Bruce Springsteen? None of their hands went up. Now, there's no, I'm not saying that there's a requirement that you have to know about Bruce Springsteen in order to be educated, but that's the kind of thing that we don't share this knowledge base. Um, you know, that enables somebody, in education, you talk about what they know and then you bring them to what they don't know. But you don't, you have to keep going lower, 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 and you don't know where the bottom is, where you're going to start, what do they actually know? The Civil War, the American Revolution. I mean, we drilled on that stuff, with the names of all the different people, Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben and Kosciuszko. I mean, they were cramming large amounts of information into our head, so we could talk amongst each other. But today, that's kind of what I was talking about.
I'll butcher another quote similar to how I probably butchered the Greek philosophy quote of the only thing I really know is that I know nothing. There's another quote I'm about to butcher, but I'll do my best, where there are many things of which a wise man should be ignorant of. So I'll challenge you on this. So somebody doesn't know Bruce Springsteen, yeah? They're ignorant to that. But some people are disciplined where they choose to be ignorant of certain things because they're focused on things that they find important. So maybe they're an engineer, maybe they're working on, I don't know, SpaceX, and they're trying to find a way to get to Mars just because there might be a population issue in this country in the future, something like that, right? Just a general example. So they choose to be ignorant of pop culture, Bruce Springsteen, or they don't care much about which country calls their capital, Italy and Rome, right? So they choose to be ignorant of certain topics because they're becoming experts or productive workers in a certain field. So there are many things a wise man wishes to be ignorant of or chooses to be ignorant of. What are your thoughts on that quote, and then also that me challenging you that hold on a sec. All right, fine. They're ignorant of Bruce Springsteen. They're ignorant of the Civil War. I mean, I'm not encouraging that, but I want to hear your take on selective choosing to be ignorant of certain things because there are only so many hours in a day, and where are you gonna what do you value? What do you find important? What do you want to focus on? So what do you think about that?
I don't think anybody is well said by being ignorant of the very things that would liberate them so that they're not slaves of fashion or slaves of other people.
Mhm.
However, of course, there's expertise, right? The things that a civil engineer is expert at are different from the things that a knee surgeon is knowledgeable about. Uh, you know, um, the disciple master model, if you when you apply it to that, is whatever chosen field that you're in. But there are certain basics that everybody should know so that they're not slaves. It's one thing to be an engineer, it's one thing to be a medical doctor. But how do you know you're a good engineer? Is it because you make more money than somebody else? Is it because you become famous? Is it because your engineering is very efficient and cost effective? Is it because your engineering is um, um, friendly towards the environment?
Mhm.
Is it because your engineering is accessible to a large number of people? How do you know? Where's the values?
Mhm.
Uh, you know, uh, that's where a liberal arts education comes in. Um, it's not designed to make you an engineer or a medical doctor. It's designed to free you. Then, obviously, uh, depending upon, like you have expertise that you've developed over the years in your chosen field. Um, but that's over and above. The education I'm talking about is fundamental education, the ability to know how to tell something is true from something is false, how to decide that something is valuable and something is not valuable, or something is more valuable, something is less valuable. Those are the types of things that I think the education that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about educating people to be computer engineers or structural engineers or aviation engineers. That's not the kind of and also here's where I come from, the ivory tower. I think a person shouldn't specialize in the very beginning. Everybody, whether you're a plumber or whether you're a professor, should know basically the same thing. Should basically have a college education. And then let the industry teach you what you need to know. It used to be that to become a lawyer, you just clerked.
Mhm.
You got your basic education. By the way, the people who wrote the Constitution of the United States, they could read Latin, they could read Greek, they knew all the philosophers. They were extremely liberally educated individuals. You know, so you know, once you have the basics, like I was talking about a clerk, right? You got this basic education, and then you went and you worked in a lawyer's office as an apprentice, and you clerked for the lawyer, and then when you knew enough from following the lawyer was the master, you were the disciple, and then you took the bar exam, and if you passed, you became a lawyer. You know, we have this idea. Well, another subject we could talk about is idolatry, right? We have this idea that, well, we have to start preparing kindergarten kids because they're going to have to go out and make a living and they want to make a good living, right? Education is not about making a living. Education is about living. And then, I graduated from college in 1970 with a degree, a bachelor's degree in modern European history. And then I wound up working in the family business, and I went to a plumbing apprenticeship for 5 years. I was an apprentice plumber, and there were masters the first year, the second year, and then I became a plumber. That's how I made my living, but I had the liberal education behind me. And then, of course, I was able eventually later on to go on and get a master's degree and so forth. But this is why, and I don't think my ideas are widely shared. That's why I call myself I'm in the Ivory Tower, because a lot of people say that, you should learn to be a plumber starting from the first grade, or go to trade school and high school, never mind college, right? College should be for everybody who can do it, to liberate them, and then become a plumber, become an electrician, become a professor, whatever. But I can hear the people saying he's being ridiculous.
Okay. So
What can I say?
how do you determine what is true and what is false?
uh, by using the accumulated wisdom of and I'm speaking from the West. I'm a Westerner, I'm not an Easterner. The accumulated wisdom that's been derived from Western history, starting with the philosophers, and having studied fallacies. What makes a statement true? I took geometry. Geometry is all about proofs, logic, all about the rules of logic and determining true statements from false statements. Epistemology, how do we learn? How do we know things? How can we tell? How do we know what we know? Things like that. I've studied that. Hard. They're reading hours and hours and taking exams and so forth. Um, it doesn't prevent you from error, right? Error is human, but it makes you less likely to error because you have a clear way of thinking about things. Your brain is not a bunch of mush. You know, ideas, ideas come in, statements come in, and they're not mushed around. They fit into a fabric, and you can detect fallacies, and and they have terms. There are names for them. They're all historically logical fallacies, and you can tell a person's argument has fallen into a fallacy. One of the common fallacies is you know. Um, argumentum ad baculum, the argument from authority, right? Whoa, so and so said it must be true. The fact that some brainiac like me says something does not make it true,
Mhm.
right? Now, of course, you're going to listen to me because I'm a brainiac, but then you're going to say, but is it really true? Maybe he made a big mistake here. Anyway, that's that, and we could all think there was a time when the prevailing wisdom, even the philosophers, thought the earth was flat, right? It seems to be, right? You go left, you go right, it seems flat. Well, that was, there's where humility comes in, right? We know now that the world is not flat, it's round. So you know, you have to use tried and true wisdom in order to determine what's true, what's false, and be humble. And realize that maybe what I think today has to be modified. That's revisionism.
Yeah. That was one of my favorite courses in high school was logic. Now, I think that was part of sequential math one or maybe sequential math two, but the logic section, which we spent maybe a month or two on.
That's probably symbolic logic. There's a branch of logic which is part of math, which is called symbolic logic, which is logic. But then there's non-symbolic logic.
Well, we chain rule. I remember chain rule a bit, and or statements, and there's some proofs. We did a lot of proofs, and
Right.
I feel like that's an interesting way to go about logic and arguments and searching for truth. So it's a similar question to earlier, but a little bit of a twist on it. What's something that you believed to be false, and now you believe to be true?
I don't know. I don't know if I could answer that. I know a typical fallacy that I used to come across a lot when I worked for the housing authority in construction management. Contractor would be hired to do a certain job, let's say to replace refuse compactors in a series of buildings. And and the manager of the buildings or the superintendent of the buildings maybe didn't get along with the contractor. The contractor was sent from the main office. They had a contract with the housing authority. The local superintendent had no choice, had to deal with this person. Maybe they didn't like the person, whatever. And the job, let's say the job was mostly complete, maybe just some punch list items had to be taken care of. But the contractor wasn't on the job, right? As far as the superintendent knew. And in the morning, the superintendent would see the contractor's truck driving down the street. He wouldn't know where the contractor's truck was going, but he would assume maybe he's going to one of my buildings, right? He's got to finish the painting here or do something like that. And then he would get a complaint from from a certain building that the drain was backing up in the compactor room. And he would jump to the conclusion that that contractor did something wrong in that building. That's why that's backing up. I saw him this morning, and now the drain is backing up. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc, after something there because of something.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, the contractor wasn't even going there; he was going some other job. But you jump to the conclusion, right? So I used to have to tell him, you can't assume that the contractor did something wrong. You don't even know if he was there. So don't jump to conclusions. So that was a common type of fallacy. And a lot of people, they fall into that fallacy. It's not necessarily exactly like that, but it's the same type of thing. Something happens after something, right? A child reads a book about a certain thing, and then they decide that they're that way, right? Let's say transgender or something like that. Oh, see, if the child didn't read that book, they wouldn't have these ideas,
Mhm.
and that's a fallacy.
Mhm.
If you want to find out where the ideas came from, you have to investigate. That's epistemology. But you can't assume simply because they read the book and therefore they think this way that that's the cause.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily a causal issue. It could be simply coincidence.
Cause,
Fallacy.
causation and correlation, but
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's the current term. Yeah.
the I heard the word assume a few times during this conversation, and assume can be spelled ASSUME, right? Another expression goes, if you assume, you make an ass out of you and me,
Right.
ASSUME. So you gotta watch out for those assumptions, right? When you're making lazy, especially lazy assumptions or kind of any assumption, gotta be careful with those. I think it's really important to challenge your own assumptions and to because the assumptions can lead to a lot of miscommunication, in my view.
Well, scientific method is built on assumptions. Um, you know, you're made aware of a hypothesis, and you're made aware of certain experimentations that prove the hypothesis. So you assume the hypothesis. Then you duplicate the experiment to determine is the assumption correct or not. So you have to have a healthy degree of skepticism, but you can't avoid assumptions. I'll tell you, an assumption that people have, which is dangerous on rare occasions, is that when an elevator door opens, you walk in because there's the elevator, right? And 999,000 times out of 100,000 times, the elevator is there. But on occasion, the elevator door opens and the elevator is not there, and people, if they don't have that skepticism, let me see the elevator first before I step in, they just go, and there's a certain number of fatalities every year because of the elevator door opening without the elevator being there. Now it's a safe assumption that the elevator is there when the door opens. There's nothing wrong with that assumption. Check it. Check. What is it? Trust but verify. Trust the elevator is there, but make sure you see the floor of the elevator before you step onto it.
Okay. So continuing with, again, we'll say teaching and training and coaching and mentoring, this theme as we talk about teaching, and even masters, right? So who is a teacher that comes to mind in your life, whether it's or even a trainer kind of on the job in the housing authority, or a teacher in liberal arts? Who's somebody that comes to mind personally that you said that's one of my favorite teachers? And that's where I think the end statement comes in, because we can be disciplined to principles, and but also there's the people element, right? It's there's a human element. So who's somebody that comes to mind? But man, that was a really good teacher to me.
Uh, I think first of all, teachers that I had in graduate school. Um, uh, I think one of the teachers that I appreciated the most is still a professor. He's full professor now, Chris Denny. Um, history, theological history is what I took him for, historical theology, a couple of different classes. You know, um, I had a scripture professor who, when I got my master's, I didn't have a mentor. We didn't have them, but he would have been my mentor. Jean-Pierre Ruiz. He still writes. He's a writer. Um, I can remember like Dr. Proofer. If I remember his name correctly, I had him for philosophical anthropology as an undergraduate. Um, and I remember him, and I remember some of the things I learned in this class.
Mhm.
So you remember, I'm sure you remember certain teachers that you had maybe at Malloy or Fordham. Yeah,
Sure. So
and then feedback.
for example, the first one was a Chris Denning. Was that
Jenny,
Denning?
DNNY.
DNNY. So what made this person a good teacher to you?
Uh, I would say he was very disciplined. In other words, he basically stuck to the syllabus. He led us through the curriculum step by step. Very knowledgeable. Um, uh, it's hard to say. It's kind of a je ne sais quoi, as they say in French. I don't know exactly what. Um, he liked my work. That helped. He called me the class valedictorian. That this was in the beginning of at least from my experience, learning management systems, and we had this learning management system, and you would so there was like a class homepage, right? And it had this opportunity that you could submit articles that you thought people should read, right? So I had just read an article from the Journal of Biblical Literature, and I thought it was applicable to some of the things we were talking about in class. So I uploaded the article, right? And I thought that was it. So shortly after that, I had a meeting with Dr. Denny because if you were doing a paper, he wanted to see the draft. So you would go in and you would sit with him, and he would go through the draft and he would make certain suggestions and so forth. And then I'd have to mention to him that I had uploaded this article, and he went like this. He went, "What?" He said, "Oh, I have to approve it, otherwise they're not going to put it on here." Nobody ever submitted articles, right? So he went on and he said, and he found the article. Oh, good, good. He was so happy that somebody finally used that button, and that he never looked at it. So, but when I told him, oh, so he gave it the approval, and then it was uploaded. So I took him by surprise because I took him up, but it was not his offer. It was the university. Every class had the same opportunity, but nobody ever took advantage of it, and I did. So he was very impressed by that, and I was impressed too. I got a little like this.
It sounds like he was encouraging, but also you learned from him. So I
Oh
think,
yes, and he was very. Um, I don't want to call him strict, but he was rigorous. Got a lot of complaints, by the way. A lot of complaints. He gave a lot of graded work. So if you had these little five, reflection, one paragraph reflection papers, right? And if you had 10 of them during the course of the semester, what could each one be worth? Out of 100 points, right? Because you had exams, you had major papers and all. So they were worth like 3 points, right? So he would give people back the paper, and if it was worth three, maybe they get 2.4 or 2.2. And they used to complain, what the hell? He took point four off that. What is what? And they used to grouse about it. Some of them dropped the course, because of it. And it seemed to me, and I had the same issue with my classes when I started teaching there, is that, when you have a lot of graded work, each piece is not worth that much. When a student was behind in their work towards the end of the semester, I said, forget this small stuff that gets you a point and a half. Give me the work that's worth 5 points or the work that's worth 15 points. Put the effort there. Don't give me all these little scratchy things that are going to get you 5 points. Get 20 points towards your final grade. Anyway, but and so he was very fastidious, So he would carefully grade each thing, and he'd take off like a uh, point zero 0.01 here, 0.5 here, all that. I had to do that if you're going to use that kind of methodology.
okay. And the other teacher was John Pierre. Is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah, Jean-Pierre Ruiz.
What made him a
Uh,
good teacher?
well, my concentration was in biblical studies. So I had to take most of my courses in biblical studies, and then had to take a diverse group of other courses. And I took him for most of my classes, and very knowledgeable. He's a translator. We would sit there. We would be reading passages from the Hebrew Bible, and he'd be reading it in Hebrew as we went along. Um, and a little. He had a wry sense of humor, very relaxed, and I learned a lot of things. I was fairly familiar. I had taken good Bible classes as an undergraduate, but you take them at undergraduate level. I studied Greek, I studied Hebrew. Um, I was, he, I learned a lot of things from him that have stood me well in the years since. Put that way. And he was also the chairman of the department when I got my degree. That rotates. That job as chairman rotates.
Huh? So what about, let's say, on the job? Let's say, for instance, we'll say plumbing, right? Whether it's in the housing authority or in the family business. Like, who is somebody throughout your career where you said, man, that person is just excellent, like somebody really like there's like a master, they're really great at what they do. Admirable, kind of say like a master, just the level of excellence in plumbing.
Uh, my fifth year apprenticeship, um, we had one class would be theory, one class would be shop. And I had this instructor, Kurt Werber, and he had well, what we call a jobbing business. That's what yeah. We're gonna call it quits soon because we all the people that have signed into the podcast are now sleeping. They're like this. Yes. Can I talk?
You'll be on episode number 7, maybe. Tell mom should be on episode number 7 if she wants.
Um, a jobbing business where you go into people's homes and you do work primarily in people's homes. He knew plumbing, and um, other plumbing companies would call him in for specialty jobs, and he would talk about them. You know, not that this is plumbing, but he served in the Air Force in Greenland, and he said, when they would construct these facilities, the first thing they'd have to do is they had to put um, refrigeration lines into the ground. And you would say, refrigeration grounds, this is Greenland. It's frozen all the time because of the permafrost. If you put a building on permafrost, the heat from the building starts to melt the permafrost and the building will start to sink into the ground. So you have to put refrigeration to keep the ground frozen so the building doesn't. That's not plumbing. But anyway, he had a lot of experiences like that. And then when I went to work with the housing authority first as a plumber's helper. So I worked alongside a plumber, Steve DeVito. Probably deceased now. He was a wonderful guy, wonderful guy. As a matter of fact, you probably don't remember him, but he and his wife used to come to visit us. They gave the binoculars that we still have, one for you and one for Timothy. Anyway, he was a good plumber, and he had, in the old days, the art of plumbing, using hot lead and solders and all that. He was very, very good. Learned a lot from him. But I met so many people that taught me so many things in the years.
Okay, so we'll move towards conclusion here. It sounds like mom wants it to conclude soon. We've been at it for an hour and a half, so approximately. So it's
I
not.
think you got the extra half hours on overtime, right? You got
Uh,
extra pay.
sure. Time and a half. Time and a half. But we'll move towards conclusion. But thank you. This was super interesting when it comes to the topics of education and teaching and liberal arts, and also grappling with what's true, right, and what's false, and how to go about day to day in this world, especially with the amount of information that's out there and the speed at which it travels and the different ways it's distributed and by whom it's distributed. So kind of spot on with what I was hoping for as in the first episode of kind of my first intention, teaching and coaching and training, etc. And then also kind of hits the my second, which was really looking to understand different professions and different businesses. So it's interesting to learn about the teaching profession and a bit about the plumbing profession. That's another, and then and we could go off on some tangents along the way and have some fun with it and explore some ideas.
Well,
Um,
what's most important to me is this idea of education as liberating.
mhm,
It's the goal of education is to liberate,
mhm,
not to enslave.
mhm. Okay, I think that's a wonderful way to conclude the podcast, first episode, and I hope to have you back on a future podcast if you're interested.
Okay. I'll
And
be
again,
very interested in the comments that are going to come in to see how people react to
I'm
this.
hoping we get at least one listener or one viewer because I'm going to upload this to YouTube and it'll be under the Matthew Blaine channel. So that's spelled Matthew, Mattthew, and last name Blaine, B as in Bravo, Laine, Matthew Blaine. And that's the way to find this on YouTube. And then I'll try to get it onto other platforms as well. But hopefully get at least one view And you know what? It'd be even great to get at least one comment. That'd be amazing.
Yes. Okay.
And your coordinates, so but people might be reaching out to you directly, and that's
Okay.
Blaine D. So Blaine D as in Douglas
Right.
at stjohns.edu.
That's
And
it.
and St. John's is STJOHNS or Saint spelled out.
No, it's STJOHNS. Right.
All right, well,
STJOHNS.edu.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. What's for dinner tonight, by the way?
Linguine and clam sauce.
Oh, it sounds delicious. Enjoy it.
Thank you.
Tell
Thank
mom,
you.
tell mom I said hi, and she'll be on episode
Okay.
number 7, maybe.
All righty. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.